Okay. Well, let me just say a few words of introduction and welcome. Um, we were chatting a little earlier, and it is now Thursday morning in Melbourne, Australia, where Chris is speaking to us from. And as he pointed out, we still have the privilege of a very special day today, Valentine's Day. But for him, that's just a past memory now. Chris is a lecturer, senior lecturer at Monash University, a top university in Australia, in Melbourne. And he is in French studies. As well as French studies, however, he has a remarkable breadth of interests and of topics he's written on. On his academic CV, I think it will tell us that he is working in modern and contemporary European thought, atheism, perhaps. I'm not sure if you've got this on your academic CV, the relationship between the Bible and philosophy. I never quite had the nerve to do that at my university. So that's wonderful. And Chris's published work runs the gamut from academic to more popular, and from more secular, formal academic work to work such as we're going to be hearing about this afternoon. A title that I think has interested a number of us is his 2022 book, Biblical Critical Theory, How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. That's a wonderfully engaging title. And today's talk, I suspect, may draw upon that, the Bible as a tool for changing culture. So welcome, Chris, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you ever so much, David, for those wonderful words of welcome. And thank you again, just formally to everybody. I know we had to rearrange the date for this due to something that happened in my family. And we're all very grateful for your flexibility in that and the way that it allowed us to be as a family over the past few weeks. So thank you. Thank you for being willing to rearrange. If I seem distracted momentarily once in a while, it's because I'm just checking that there are no new people that need to be admitted to the meeting. From speaking with Gordon in preparation for this, I'm planning to speak for about 45 minutes, after which time I think there's going to be some interaction. So do please, if anything I say provokes you, or you want to know more, or you think I don't explain sufficiently, do make a note and there'll be time to discuss those things at the end. I will share my screen if I'm able. Here we go. Perfect. So the title that I've been given today is The Bible as a Tool for Changing Culture, which I suppose sounds somewhat provocative, but I hope to try to explain why not only am I convinced that the Bible is a tool for changing culture, but perhaps it is in some important ways the only such tool, or the only tool by which we can be sure that culture is being genuinely changed. So I want to set the bar quite high for what I'm arguing, and see if I can convince you of that argument by the time that we finish today. As David said, I will be speaking mainly about the 2022 book, Biblical Critical Theory. And I want to begin by addressing head on a question that I've often been asked about that book, which is, so what is even biblical critical theory? Anyway, what does the term mean? And I want to come at it through an observation made by Tim Keller in a foreword that he wrote to a book by Jake Meador about the common good. And it is one of those passages that when I first read it, it really hit me between the eyes. It really seemed to crystallize something that I was inchoately aware of, but hadn't quite grasped in this way. So let me read you what Keller writes, and then we'll think about it together for a minute. He writes, I have been an ordained minister for nearly 45 years. When I entered the ministry, most of the divisions in the church seemed to be doctrinal. There were controversies about the charismatic gifts and Pentecostalism, about the end times and the second coming of Christ, about predestination and free will, about the meaning of baptism and the Lord's Supper. I entered a Presbyterian denomination in which there was a high degree of consensus on all those issues. Yet today, my church, like so many others, is sharply divided, despite the fact that its ministers can agree on a very long and detailed doctrinal statement, the Westminster Standards. So why all the conflict? It is not as much over doctrine as over what our relationship to the culture should be. And as I look around, I see the same division royal in Christian denominations and organizations everywhere. Now, I don't know about you, but that rings very deeply true to me. When I was an undergraduate back in the last millennium now, the things that really got Christians hot under the collar tended to be around the charismatic gifts. That was in the Christian Union that I was part of. That was what we were always falling out about. Not so much now, I get the sense. What certainly animates Christians on Twitter today, on the platform formerly known as Twitter, is how Christians should relate to the culture, whether Christians should be somewhat withdrawing from modern culture and taking up a very antagonistic approach to it, whether we should be seeking to get alongside modern culture, and how we should be understanding the influence that the culture has on the church. And biblical critical theory, one way of thinking about what the project is trying to do, is to stake out a position in that debate that seeks to be faithful to the way in which Scripture itself engages the cultures around it. And we can go into more detail about that when we come to discussion, if you like. So what does that look like? What does it mean to try and take a scriptural approach to engaging with culture? Well, there are certain indications within the scriptures themselves that give us a sense of how scripture is being, how culture is being engaged. There is a really interesting repeated pattern in the Bible of telling the Bible's overarching story as a way to make sense of the present. So if you think, for example, of Stephen's speech in Acts 7, how does he make sense of the accusations that he's facing from the Jewish authorities in his moment? He tells the story of Israel in a particular way. We see this in Hebrews 11, Psalm 78, Psalms 105-6, Galatians 3 and 4, and other examples as well. It seems that there's a sense in the Bible of the whole story makes sense of the present. And the way that we understand how we relate to the cultures around us is by telling the whole Bible story: creation, fall, redemption, consummation. That both helps Christians to understand who we are, because this, of course, is a story that makes sense of us, created in God's image, fallen, rebelling against him, redeemed through Christ. All of those are necessary to understand who we are. And they're also necessary to understand how we position ourselves in contemporary society, how we live, whether, for example, we consider the structures of society as they are today to be original and natural, whether we consider them to be changeable, what we think of how we are in this particular cultural moment as human beings. And it struck me as I was thinking through this material in preparation for writing the book, that the way in which the Bible presents reality and culture to us has certain important shapes of thinking in common with what modern critical theories do. And by critical theories, I'm thinking of, for example, people like Simone de Beauvoir and her feminism, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault. Now, before I go any further, I need to say that I'm not suggesting that the Bible agrees with all of these different critical theories at all points. In fact, they don't agree with each other. But what I'm suggesting is that there's a commonality on the level of the type of moves they perform in relation to culture. Specifically, that both modern critical theories and the Bible are making certain things in the world viable, certain things visible, and certain things valuable. So let's take some concrete examples of that. Take Marxism, for example, one of the archetypal modern critical theories. Just let someone in here. There we go. If you haven't read a lot of Marx, you might think that a proletarian revolution is really fanciful. There's no chance that anything like that could possibly happen in the real world. And then you read enough Marx and see how he thinks, and it becomes clear to you that he, at least, thinks that that is something viable in the world. You may end up agreeing with him, you may not, but you can see how for him, this is a real possibility. That revolution is viable, it's part of what is possible in the world. Or think, for example, of the many different 20th and 21st century feminisms and the way in which they make things visible in the world. So it may not have struck you, particularly if like me, you're a man, that there are in many ways one rule for men and another rule for women in so many different areas of society. And what the feminisms do often is they make that visible. They say, notice this, look at this. This is something out there that you may not have noticed in society. And these modern critical theories make things valuable as well. So when I was an undergraduate studying many of these theories, it became very clear to me very quickly that whenever the verb transgress, the noun transgression was mentioned, it was almost always a positive thing. It was good to transgress norms and boundaries. And whenever tradition was mentioned, that was almost always a negative thing. And so the certain things were made valuable. Transgression is valuable. Tradition is negatively coded. And so these critical theories are making things viable, visible, and valuable in the world. Let's come to the Bible. What is the Bible doing? Well, of course, the Bible is an incredibly complex text, and we can't sort of strip it down to one thing. The Bible is the sword of the Spirit. It's living and active. It's God-breathed and so forth. And I don't want to suggest in what I'm about to say that any of those things are not the case, but I'm just focusing on one particular thing that the Bible is doing among all these other things. And that is that it too is making certain things viable and visible and valuable in the world. So, for example, you may, if you're not a Christian, never have considered that trusting the promises of the God of the Bible is something that you could possibly do with your life. I suspect if you went into the streets of Vancouver, where many of you guys are, or Melbourne, where I am today, and shoved a microphone under people's noses and said, have you ever considered trusting the promises of the God of the Bible? If people were being honest with us, the response that they would give would not be, yes, well, actually, I have considered that. And on balance, I decided not to. It would be more something like, what planet have you landed from? That's just a ridiculous idea. I've no way to engage with that as a viable idea. But then you read enough of the Bible and you see how God deals with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and how he makes verbal promises that can be understood, and how he systematically keeps those promises. And although you may not trust that God, you can see what it might look like to do so. It's become something that's viable for you. It's possible. You can see how it might work in a person's life. Or consider how the Bible makes things visible as well. Think of that beautiful psalm that the heavens declare the glory of God. It may be that you've looked up at many sunsets in your time, and the thought has never occurred to you, isn't that a wonderful testament to God's glory? But the psalm makes that visible for you. It makes the glory of God visible in the beautiful sunrise or the beautiful sunset in a way that it may not have been before. And the Bible also makes certain things valuable for us. So before I became a Christian, about 15 years of age, if you had said to me, do you know, serving other people should be something that you should aspire to do with your life, I would have just looked at you askance. Other people serving me was really attractive, but the thought that I would want to invest my time and energy serving other people was just not something on my radar at that time. It wasn't something that made sense to me. But then when I became a Christian and when I saw the beauty in the lives of other Christians who were serving me, and when I read verses like, Mark 10:45, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, you see, wow, okay, this is, if I'm going to be a Christian, this is something that's really important. Like, service is at the heart of this ethic, and it's something I better get on board with. And so it makes that valuable for me in a way that it wasn't before. And so, in their very different ways, modern critical theories and the Bible are both making certain things in the world viable and visible and valuable for us. And so there's a conversation on that level that can happen between them. By no means are they making the same things viable, visible, and valuable, but they're performing the same sort of moves, each in their own way. And crucially for our purposes today, the Bible in particular, and modern critical theories as they would like to think of themselves, are also showing that the world as it currently exists is what I've called here variable on the screen. And by that, I mean that the way things currently are is not the way they have to be. Present cultural reality is contingent. It can change. And that, of course, is incredibly important if we're going to have a way of critiquing society. If we don't think there can be meaningful cultural change, then there's no point in critiquing the status quo, because there's nothing we can do about it. And if one thing comes out of the way that the Bible engages with culture, it is that culture is not immutable. If you think about the book of Daniel, it's the Lord who raises up particular dynasties and empires, and who decides how long they will last, and who brings them to naught in the end. And the Bible is very clear that the way things are now is not the way that they've always been. We are at a particular point in a story, which is not the whole story. And so cultural reality, biblically speaking, is profoundly variable, profoundly contingent, which is necessary if we're to do any meaningful cultural critique. So that's the, if you like, the methodological superstructure for the idea of biblical critical theory. What I'd like to do now is make two arguments, one of which I hope is relatively easy to swallow, and the other one, I hope actually is a little bit harder, a bit provocative. I want to argue that critical theory, the enterprise of critiquing the status quo of a particular cultural moment, is historically Christian, biblical in origin. That's the lower bar of the argument. And actually that it's also necessarily biblical. That's the harder argument, the one that I suspect you may have more trouble swallowing. So let's start with the easy one. Critical theory is historically biblical. Think about the ancient world and all the different societies that there were. I went to an exhibition recently in Sydney, here in Australia, about Ramses and his Egypt. And one thing was very clear to me from that exhibition, which was that whatever Ramses said went. He was both the locus of power and the locus of truth in his society, and there was no distinction between the two. If you disagreed with Ramses, your days were numbered. There was no sense that one could legitimately and meaningfully critique what Ramses was saying. And this is by and large the general pattern for most ancient societies, with one very weird exception. Because at the heart of Hebrew society, there's this very peculiar institution of prophecy. And the prophets have authority. People listen to what they say and care about what they say, but they have no power. The function of prophets, often, one of the main functions of prophets in the Bible, is indeed to speak truth to power, to say to the reigning monarch that what they're doing is against God's will and that they jolly well ought to repent, or his judgment is coming. And this idea of splitting the locus of truth from the locus of power in a society, and of the possibility of speaking truth to power and, at least sometimes, living to tell the tale, is fundamental, isn't it, to any idea of cultural critique. If truth and power are utterly identified with each other, then there can be no meaningful cultural critique. And so prophecy brings into our social imaginary the idea that power can be critiqued authoritatively, and that it is legitimate to do so. And I don't think we should take that for granted. That's not a universal aspect of social imaginaries. Not everyone has thought that way. And it is a particularly biblical way of thinking, because, of course, the ultimate locus of power isn't with the king. The king is subordinate to God. And so there's this fundamental split between executive authority, the king, locus of truth, which is the true prophet, God's prophet, and ultimate power, which is God, which is very unusual in ancient societies. And we see this follow through in the New Testament. Jesus is a great critic of the powers and authorities of his day, the Pharisees and the scribes, the teachers of the law. He reserves his strongest invective by far for the powerful in his own culture. You brood of vipers. He doesn't throw that language around at everybody. He reserves it for the powerful in his own particular cultural moment. And so this idea of cultural critique continues in the New Testament. And when we move beyond the New Testament canon, I think we see this continued in the Christian tradition. There's an Augustine scholar at the University of Virginia called Charles Matthews, an eminent Augustine scholar. And he makes the argument at a couple of points in his work that the first time in our tradition, the Western tradition, that we see the whole of a culture critiqued from a position, a consistent position outside that culture, is Augustine's City of God. Now, of course, there have been moments of cultural critique in the tradition, you know, Cicero and so forth, a critiquing aspects of culture. But what Matthews is getting at is the idea of taking a step back from the whole of a culture, all of its different sort of parts of its ecosystem, and critiquing it from a consistent point of view that is outside that culture, which, of course, for Augustine, critiquing the culture of late Rome is a consistently biblical position. And he says that's the first time we see that. And if he's true, if he's correct in saying that, and I'm persuaded that he is, then the origin of what we call cultural critique today, which is precisely taking a step back from the whole of a culture, ranging over it and critiquing it from an ideological position outside of it, that historically happens to be Christian in its origin. And all that goes by the name of cultural critique today is traced back in one way or another to Augustine's City of God. So that's a historical argument. I now want to try and make the stronger, perhaps more contentious argument that if we are to do something called cultural critique, and if that is to be meaningful, then it has to either be biblical or imitate and approximate a biblical way of looking at the world. Let me try and explain myself. What you need in order to be able to critique a particular cultural moment with any degree of authority. In other words, to be able to say something more than, I don't like this particular aspect of culture, or it sends off negative chemicals in my mind, or I have a negative attitude to it. In other words, for me to be able to say, no, this is not something simply that I feel, but there is an injustice here that, whether you recognize it or not, is unjust for both of us. An injustice that goes beyond my my own subjective sense. Well, you need somewhere to stand that is outside the cultural moment itself. Otherwise, you end up bootstrapping yourself. Because if I try to judge the status quo by the status quo, then I'm in a circular argument, aren't I? I'm not really judging it by anything outside itself. I'm not really critiquing it at all. And this is the problem that a lot of cultural critique finds itself in if it doesn't have anywhere to stand outside the way that things are. So what you often find is that approaches to culture will take one aspect of the way things are and use that as a yardstick against which to measure other aspects of the way things are. Let me give you two examples. First of all, pre-revolutionary France, Ancien Régime France. It's a very centralized, sort of absolute idea of government, with the king right at the center of society. Think of Louis XIV as the Sun King. And within a certain way of arguing back then, well, of course we would do society in this way, because after all, it is natural. Look up at the heavens. What do you see? Well, you see one sun, as Copernicus has recently told us, at the center of the solar system, and all the other planets revolving around that one sun. So the way that nature works is as one thing in the center, and everything else revolves around that. So how do we build society then? Well, let's follow the natural pattern. We'll have one absolute monarch in the center, and indeed Louis XIV was called the Sun King, and this was one of the reasons that he had that epithet. And everything should revolve around him. It's natural. That's just cutting with the grain of the way things are. Fast forward to the 20th century, mid-20th century, and the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze. And his understanding of reality is that difference and multiplicity always precede identity. Identity is an effect of the slowing down of difference. And lo and behold, how should we therefore do politics and society? Well, it should be, according to him, a politics and society that privileges difference and fracturing and multiplicity over identity. And in other words, we've taken the way things are, difference before identity, and we've reflected that in our politics. Now, which of these is correct? Well, in a sense, it's impossible to arbitrate between them, because they're both doing the same thing. They're both taking one aspect of what there is and using it to measure and evaluate the rest of what there is. There's one sun in the center of the solar system. Everything goes around it. That's the way we should do society. There's one, so multiplicity is primary, and therefore we should reflect that in society. The problem comes when a disagreement emerges between those positions. How do you decide which way to go? Now, we can all have certain impulses and predilections, but it's hard to make those stick with other people. It's hard to convince someone reasonably that my predilections, my sense of which bit of what there is to choose as the measure of what there is, should prevail, for example, over your sense. And so what we find in a lot of cultural discussion, and increasingly so, I think, is an attempt to silence those who disagree with you and to shout longer and louder than they do as a way of winning the debate, because there's no other way to arbitrate. There's no sort of way of deciding from within how things are, which bit of how things are should be the measure of how things are. And so it's not only epistemologically problematic, but it's also socially quite fractious to do cultural critique in this way. You know, you've got your Sun King people over here, and you've got your Deleuzians over there, and they're just at each other all the time. And of course, there are different ways of passing out these differences today. And it becomes a very adversarial, very quickly, very ad hominem environment in which to do cultural critique. And perhaps that is precisely what we're seeing in cultural discussions today. What we need is somewhere to stand outside the way things are, some measure of the way things are that isn't drawn out simply of the way things are themselves. And this is something that cultural critics who hold no brief for Christianity sometimes acknowledge. That there's a very interesting moment towards the end of a book called Minima Moralia by the Frankfurt School critic Theodor Adorno. So he was one of the people who sometimes today are called cultural Marxists, by no means a Christian in any way, shape, or form. And towards the end of Minima Moralia, he says, look, in order to do cultural critique, what we need is, quote, a standpoint of redemption. Curious. Now, he's not trying to open the door to Christianity at that point, but isn't it interesting that he reaches for that theological register in order to describe a legitimate basis for cultural critique? In other words, we need to be able to stand somewhere where we can see what things look like when they're working well, what a redeemed version of reality looks like, in order to be able to know which bits of current reality are not working well. It's very hard to know whether a machine is functioning correctly unless you know what it looks like when it's functioning correctly, and to know what bits of it are wrong. So Adorno uses this language of the standpoint of redemption. And what the Christian biblical view of reality gives you precisely is that standpoint. Because from a Christian point of view, the way that the world is now is neither the world it was originally created and intended to be, nor as the world as it will be when it is fully redeemed and restored. And so both in Eden and at the end of the book of Revelation, we have a measure of redemptive reality against which to be able to say with a certain degree of authority that particular aspects of the way things are now are unjust. Not simply because I say they're unjust, or I feel they're unjust, or I've been told they're unjust, but by a measure that actually doesn't come from me and doesn't come from within the way things are. And that, I think Adorno sees this, that is the only basis upon which robust cultural critique can be conducted, because otherwise we're just bootstrapping ourselves all the time. And so that's my stronger argument, that critical theory, insofar as it seeks with a degree of authority to critique the status quo, must necessarily be parasitic upon something that resembles a biblical view of reality, something that gives you a standpoint of redemption. Otherwise, you're in this circularity of the Ancien Regime and Deleuze, which is just which bit of what there is are we going to choose as our measure of what there should be. In trying to think this through from a Christian point of view and trying to think how the Bible does this, I've come across no greater, more powerful, richer, more brilliant example than Augustine's City of God. Now, his cultural moment, of course, is incredibly different to ours. Late Rome is not quite the same as late modernity. But the way in which Augustine positions himself and the way that he critiques late Roman society, I think is very richly productive for thinking about our own cultural critique today and the way in which the Bible might be brought to bear on late modern society. So I just want to share some of the things that I found helpful in the City of God, and that have helped me to think about how to do biblically based cultural critique today. The first point is really sort of biographical. It's how Augustine situates himself in relation to late Roman society. Excuse me for a moment. And it's that he is both a consummate insider and a radical outsider. He's an insider in the sense that he understands Roman culture, specifically Roman rhetoric and literature, as a Roman. So he teaches rhetoric, for example, in Carthage and Rome. He's teaching young Roman people how to appreciate and understand Cicero. And it's clear from his writing that he appreciates and understands Cicero. He can see why Cicero sparkles, why he makes the Romans so excited and so proud. And so he understands the culture from the inside. He's not just sort of parachuting down into it like some sort of SWAT team to critique it and neutralize it and then airlift himself out afterwards. He has an intimate sense of why this culture is true and good and beautiful to those who are inside it. He's an insider in that sense. But he's also a consummate outsider. And part of this is just the details of his life. So he's born and brought up in North Africa rather than Rome itself. His father is pagan, and his wonderful mother Monica is a very devout Christian. And so there are those biographical details. But the main reason, I think, that he's an outsider to Rome is, to use that phrase that's sometimes used of John Bunyan, his blood runs bibline. He can't fully immerse himself in a Roman way of looking at the world because he sees the world through a biblical lens. And so Rome always appears wonky and askance to Augustine. There are these wonderful passages in the City of God where you can imagine him just suppressing laughter at the way the Romans see things. There's this one moment where he says, let me get this right. You Romans think that you need 3 separate deities to guard a door. You need one god for the door, one god for the hinges, and one god for the threshold itself. Now, the last time I looked, one door person was usually enough to do the job. So you need 3 gods to do the work of one person. And there are moments like that when you can see he's always looking at Roman culture from the outside. It's often the case, isn't it, that we are blind to the contradictions and tensions within our own culture, but we see them very well in other cultures. And this is what you see with Augustine. He's got the eyes of an outsider, someone bemused by these strange Romans. And it's the combination of those two, that he is a thorough insider. He knows why Rome is beautiful to the Romans, but he also looks at it with the eyes of an outsider that gives him this incredibly powerful standpoint of cultural critique. And I think that is the position that we would do well to cultivate as Christians in our own approach to culture, to be able to understand it from the inside, to be able to explain in words that people would be willing to own as their own why it is good and true and beautiful. So that when, for example, we've explained a particular philosophy or a particular view of the world, those who adopt that position would say, yes, you understand me. Those are the words that I would use to explain my position. But also keeping this perspective of an outsider, seeing the quirkiness and the tensions and the weirdness of the late modern culture in which we live. The second thing that I think is incredibly helpful in Augustine's approach is that he uses the whole of the Bible, so that the second half of the City of God is essentially a walk through the whole of the biblical story. He starts with the angels before creation and he finishes up with the new creation. And what that does, well, first of all, it means that he doesn't warp his cultural critique by using only his favorite passages or his favorite doctrines. And I think one of our dangers is that we either read modern culture predominantly through the lens of creation, which gives us a very sort of conciliatory view of modernity, always seeking to get alongside it, to understand it in its own terms and so forth. Or we tend to read modern culture through the lens of sin, which gives a very antagonistic, confrontational posture in relation to culture. But if we try and read the world in which we live through the lens of the whole biblical story, creation, fall, redemption, consummation, then ideally, at least, we will keep a biblical balance of emphases, that we will talk about creation, we will also talk about sin, and we will talk about redemption, and that gives a much more full-orbed, balanced biblical approach to culture than if we were to focus either intentionally or just by default on any particular moment in the Bible story. So he uses the whole of the Bible through which to read late Roman culture. Thirdly, he reads the whole of the culture. And what I mean by this is he doesn't simply pick the, I don't know what you call them, the bogey ideas, the ideas that he particularly disagrees with in Rome, single those out. And I think another tendency, another danger that we're all prone to is to see particular things within late modern culture as the things that must be resisted and attacked from a Christian point of view. And this often tends to fall out along political lines. So if we're Christians who are sympathetic predominantly with the left, we will tend to see things like corporate greed and neoliberal capitalism as the things within society that need to be called out. And if we're Christians who are broadly sympathetic with the modern political right, we're likely to see things like woke culture as the sort of shining examples of things that need to be attacked in society. And the danger of both of those positions is that they fail to see that late modernity is an ecosystem of ideas, relying on each other, supporting each other. And unless we try and engage that ecosystem as a whole, we're very unlikely to be able to understand or come to terms with or say helpful things about, to give deep critiques of any particular trends within that society. And so Augustine ranges over Roman politics, spirituality, philosophy, entertainment, games. He looks at the whole thing, and therefore he sees how it all holds together and how it works as an ecosystem, which is incredibly helpful in the City of God. My fourth point there is that he gives a deep critique of Rome. What I'm trying to get at there is that he doesn't take Rome's word for it. So Rome has a story about itself. And Augustine doesn't just take that at face value. And the way that he tries to look below the surface, this is so incredibly helpful in the City of God, is through the language of love. So he has, of course, this idea of two cities. There's the earthly city and there's the City of God. What is the big difference between them? Well, for Augustine, it's that they're animated by two different loves. The City of God by predominantly the love of God, and the earthly city by the love of self. And it's these two loves that drive and animate these cities and explain why they do what they do. And there's one point in the City of God where he says something to the effect of, as the body is carried along by its weight, we are carried along by our loves. It's our loves that explain us. And so whenever Rome is doing or saying something, Augustine is always reflexively asking, what is being loved here? What is the love that is being expressed in this action or this tradition or this belief? And it's an incredibly deep diagnostic tool that allows him to get below the surface of Rome and understand it, in many ways, in a way deeper than Rome understands itself, what is motivating it. And this is the idea that John Milbank, the contemporary theologian, calls out-narrating. And one of his arguments, I think in theology and social theory, is that for a while now, perhaps since the 19th century, secular society has been out-narrating Christianity. And what he means by that is that secular world has been telling the story of Christianity better than Christianity understands itself, at least in the secular eye. So, for example, you think you believe in a God up there in the sky, but let me explain to you what's really happening. So Sigmund Freud, it's really a sublimated desire for a father figure. That's what's really going on. Now, you don't realize that, but I'm explaining that to you. And Darwin would have his own sense of what that is, and Nietzsche would have his own sense of what that is. So that's what it means to out-narrate, to tell someone else's story at a level that claims to be deeper than the way they understand themselves. And that is what Augustine is doing with Rome. He's showing that Rome is a sort of grab bag of contradictory impulses that really don't make sense and really don't explain what they think they're explaining. But Augustine explains Rome to itself with a coherence that Rome cannot muster by its own lights. He out-narrates Rome. And I think that is incredibly helpful as a posture for Christians today. It's not a triumphalistic, it's not a sort of gotcha moment, but we would expect, would we not, if the Bible is in fact true, that the Bible would make sense of modern secular culture and late Roman culture, in fact, better than those cultures can make sense of themselves. That would not be an unreasonable assumption if we are to assume that the Bible is correct. And so that is what Augustine is doing, giving this deep critique. And finally, this will be my last point, Augustine, and this is just brilliant. This realization blew me away, and I've been sort of feasting on this insight for years now, and I'm delighted to be able to share it. It's not a new idea, and it's not my idea, but it's something that Augustine is doing that is just brilliant. And it's what some contemporary theologians have called subversive fulfillment. It's an approach to culture that shows that the gospel message both opposes modern cultural values and fulfills them at the same time. Let me show quickly what this looks like in the Bible, and then I'll just indicate what it looks like in Augustine, and then I'll finish. So the place that this comes across most clearly in the Bible, I think, is in Paul's discussion of the Greek demand for wisdom and the Jewish desire for miraculous signs in 1 Corinthians 1. And what does he do with those desires? Well, first of all, he puts very clear blue water between those and what he calls the word of the cross, the logos of the cross. You know, God has made foolish the wisdom of the world. The world in its foolishness did not know God. And so he comes to the Greeks and he says, you want wisdom? I have absolutely the opposite for you. God comes to you with foolishness. The word of the cross is foolishness. This is not what you think you are looking for. There is an antithesis between the gospel message and the cultural values that you hold. And if that was all Paul said, those people today who want to say that the gospel and culture are like oil and water would be having a field day. They would say, Paul is our man. That's exactly what we're saying. But that's not all that Paul says. He also says in the same passage, a few short verses later, the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, using the same word, wiser, that the Greeks are using for themselves. So it's at this point, he's saying, dear Greeks, are you really serious about searching for this thing you call wisdom? Because if you are, let me challenge you to find it in the place that you'd least think of ever discovering it, which is the foolishness of a man hanging on a cross, about as far from a Roman orator sort of bedecked in a toga as you could imagine. Because if you look for it there, you will find a wisdom, the riches and the depth of which you cannot even imagine at the moment. You will find the fulfillment of everything that you've been searching for and more. Will blow your categories of what wisdom can be. And that's the moment of fulfillment. Foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. You want real wisdom? Here it is, in the foolishness of the cross. And the brilliance of Paul's approach in this passage is that he doesn't water down either the antithesis or the fulfillment. The word of the cross is still foolishness to those who are perishing, and at the same time, the fulfillment of everything that they're searching for in all the wrong places. That's what subversive fulfillment is. And this is what Augustine is doing, I think, in spades in the City of God. So City of God, I think it's the preface, paragraph 1, sentence 1. In a sense, the first thing that Augustine says to you when you open the City of God. Gloriosissimam civitatem Dei. The glorious city of God is my theme in this book. It's often translated, but the first word is the glory word, gloriosissimam, most glorious. This is very cheeky. He's really provoking the Romans at this point, because of course the gloria was the word that Romans used to speak about themselves. Rome was the glorious city, the glorious culture, and the glory of Rome, of course, was a very obnoxious, unbiblical idea of glory. The glory of Rome was defeating all our enemies and bringing them back to Rome in triumphal procession as slaves, taking all of their riches and making them vassal states. That's glory. It's not a Christian idea of glory. So what is Augustine doing? Why is he using this word that he's had no chance to contextualize? He just goes straight in there and says, the city of God is glorious. I think he's doing the first part of this move of subversive fulfillment, because, of course, a Roman reading that would think, what on earth are you talking about? There's nothing glorious about the city of God at all. You Christians are weak. You're being killed. You worship a man who died on a cross. That isn't glory. So there's the antithesis. But what Augustine does, as we read through the city of God, is he redefines what true glory is. So at one point he says, Lazarus, the beggar at the rich man's door, is more glorious than the rich man. And again, the Romans are sort of rolling their eyes at this point. It's patently untrue from a Roman point of view. There is so much more glory in a patrician household than there is in a beggar. But of course, what Augustine then goes on to say is, well, yeah, but follow the story through. Lazarus is received into Abraham's bosom with a glory, with a splendor that far outshines even Caesar's palace, never mind any rich man's mansion. And so if you're after true glory, even by your own standards, you can find its ultimate fulfillment only by going via the cross. It's this same subversive fulfillment again. And I have greatly benefited, I think, from understanding a biblical approach to culture in this frame. Neither simply opposition, nor simply fulfillment, but the subversive fulfillment that Paul presents in 1 Corinthians 1 and that Augustine so brilliantly presents in the city of God as well. So I'm going to stop there. That's my best attempt at explaining why the Bible is an extremely robust and productive foundation from which to do cultural critique, and why I am particularly excited to be able to use the Bible in that way, because I think it is both helpful in the sense that it allows you to see society from a position outside itself, but also helpful for society itself. I think there's a healthiness in a biblical approach that we may want to tease out more in the Q&A. But anyway, I've said enough, so I will stop there and hand back over.
Well, thank you very, very much for that, Chris. A lot of rich material there. So we do now have Q&A time. So I would invite people to present their questions to Chris for some time now. I've actually got 3 questions here, Chris. So I'll get the ball rolling by just asking you one of them. I think what has occurred to me, and I'm sure to many of us, is this is sort of mega thinking that you're presenting here. And so it really invites from me, I think, a mega question. And you talked about, and I found this this term of Milbank's quite compelling. I read some time ago Theology and Social Theory and thought it was a remarkably innovative piece of work, but I had forgotten this term of out-narrating, which I think is very insightful. So you talk, in a sense, you present Augustine as a model for out-narrating the story that Rome told about itself. How do we out-narrate the story of modernity? And I'm, of course, not expecting more than some guidelines or directions here, but you've presented some principles, but could you take those principles a bit closer, maybe, to modernity itself?
Thank you, David. That's a really helpful question, because it is quite sort of abstract, isn't it? Let me do it by means of an example that will give sort of an indication of how this thing might work, because otherwise we're going to remain in abstractions. So think about the way in which late modernity understands human beings. Who are we? What is a human being? And if we talk in terms of tendencies, and these are to a certain extent themselves abstractions, but I think they are tendencies in the way that people see the human beings today. We can discern two very different contradictory impulses. One of which is to consider human beings as qualitatively indistinguishable from the rest of the world. So there's no fundamental difference between us and other animals. And we may like to sort of titillate ourselves with the idea that there is, but any difference that there is one of degree rather than of kind. There's no difference at all. And a lot of contemporary philosophers will go further and say that actually what we need is what they call a flat ontology, where there's no particular difference between animate life and inanimate life. That these hierarchies that we built into the way that we see the world are pernicious and destructive in different ways. And so we need to flatten our sense of reality and see nothing in particular noteworthy or exceptional about human beings at all. And this is quite an old tradition. So in the past, there were texts like Julien Frey de la Maîtrise, Man-Machine, L'Homme-Machine in French, which is essentially saying that we are a very complex machines. We may like to kid ourselves that we're modern, but fundamentally we're machines. And Hobbes, in the first chapter of Leviathan, it gives a very similar argument with strings and springs and wheels, using the mechanistic imagery of his day. So that's one tendency. But there's another tendency, which is to arrogate to ourselves the powers and privileges that traditionally were reserved for deities, particularly the Christian deity. So what does God get to do in the Bible? Well, God decides what's good and evil, and God gets to define himself. I am who I am, Exodus 3. And how do we think of human beings today? Well, we should be free to decide the meaning of our lives for ourselves. It's enshrined in law, in fact. Nobody should tell me from the outside what is good and evil. I should be able to decide those for myself, what's good for me. And my goodness, I get to define myself. Nobody should impose upon me a sense of who I am from the outside. And again, this is John Milbank in the opening chapters of Theology and Social Theory. They are very theological things to do. So we are framing ourselves in the discourse traditionally reserved for God when we do that. And so we have these two tendencies. On the one hand, you're just a machine. Dress it up however you like, but you're basically cogs and springs and wheels. On the other hand, oh, by the way, you're also a God. And you need to decide what's good and evil and define yourself. Now, go and live out that reality in psychological tranquility. Well, it's incredibly burdensome, isn't it? If that's the message that you're receiving. And I think there is some merit in that diagnosis of modern anthropologists. And so what does the Bible do? Well, the Bible makes sense of how we got there. Because what these two tendencies are doing is they're each taking part of a biblical truth and making it into the whole truth. And what they're doing is they're taking aspects. One way that you can see it is that they're taking aspects of the image of God doctrine. So what is the image of God doing? Well, among the many things that have been written about the image of God, one of the things that we can say, I think, is that there are two complementary tendencies within it. One, that the image of God confers a great dignity upon human beings. So of everything in the whole created order, only you and me and everyone who lives in the favelas of Brazil and all the little babies and all the people in old people's homes, all of us are the only people in the image of God, the only things in the image of God. So not Beethoven's Fifth, not a beautiful School of Wales, not an amazing sunset. None of that is in the image of God. So there's a huge dignity to being human. But at the very same time, there's also a humility built into this idea of the image of God, precisely because we are the image. We're not the God. We are contingent. Our being relates to something outside ourselves, the God of whose image we are. We cannot understand ourselves without understanding the God in whose image we are. And that humbles us. We're not the top dog in the universe. We're the image of the top dog. And so there's both a dignity and a humility in the image of God. And there's no sense in which they're fighting each other, like we're half dignified and half humble, or the more dignified we are, the less humble we are, anything like that. There's a harmony of these things in the image of God doctrine. But what modern anthropologists do, or at least one way of looking at them, is they rip these two ideas apart. So you can either have the humility part, you are just a machine, and that is grasping towards something that is true of the Bible. It's distorting it. But, we are made on the same day as the other animals. We are part of the creation, not the creator. We are on that side of the creator-creature distinction. There is an earthiness, and Adam it comes from the idea of earth, doesn't it? There's an earthiness about us. But that's not the whole truth. And similarly, we have this unique dignity and privilege. We are, as Tolkien put it, I think, sub-creators under God. The mandate given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is not given to all the animals. There is something unique, something special here. But it is not that we are gods. That is to rip it out of its biblical context. And so that would be one example, and I'm sorry that it took me so long to explain, of how a biblical view of reality explains late modernity to itself, perhaps better than that modernity is able to articulate its own contradictions and tensions.
Okay, thank you. That was certainly a fulsome answer to a very broad question. Now, do we have other questions? Yes, Paul?
Thank you, Dr. Watkins. If you don't mind, I feel more comfortable referring to using formality. I teach in the political science department, so I'm actually not. Yeah, thank you. I'm really not familiar with most of these writers. I teach in political science, but I do get the sense after your talk, two books I need to read next are The City of God and yours, and. I was thinking, David, your question about mega thinking and mega questions. Actually, I'm wondering if maybe I'm not sure if that's the I think a better word might be somehow in my mind a meta question, because on one hand there's something quite, I think, profound and yet very simple about, I think, what you're proposing, and I was taking notes on this, trying to organize it, but I think this is what I understand. On one hand, to critique any culture, any society, any civilization, in order to truly critique whatever it is, that thing that we're critiquing, we must necessarily, inevitably stand apart from it. Because only that standpoint would give us some distance, objectivity, analytical ability to say something about it. And yet, at the same time, if we were completely distanced from it, completely unrelated to it, people within that society or culture would basically say, you know nothing about us. You have no idea what you're talking about. So just get out of here. Right? And yet, if we try to critique from truly within that culture or civilization, and yet we are too much within or part of that civilization, then in a way, our attempt to critique may be from the very get-go, in a way, co-opted, distorted, biased by our own insideness to that culture, that civilization. And then what we have to say might not really be an accurate critique. Maybe it's like, we think it's a critique, but maybe it's something that sounds really nice that we can accept within our culture. And so even though our culture will say, yes, 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 you're absolutely right, we need to do this, we need to change this way, and yet it may not truly be a genuine critique. That's what I'm getting. And I guess the meta question I have is this: why? So I think you're saying then we need, on one hand, to be both inside the culture and yet detachable from it, like as I think you were saying, Augustine. I don't know how to pronounce the name. Augustine was, right? And it brings me, to that common Christian phrase, right? Be in the world, but not of it, which, right, we have no idea what that means. And the question I have is, well, what? Why is that somehow the necessity? And yet there's this tension, as you said, right? As you're illustrating using, the man as machine, but also man as the image of God, there's this tension. And yet the truth is both are true, right? Both are true. And is it just a matter of finding a happy medium, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and that's it? Or is there something deeper? Is there some necessity? And I don't know if it's a theological necessity or philosophical necessity, or, yeah, I'm not even sure I understand what I'm asking, but hopefully you have some ideas. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really rich, Paul. Thank you. Let me try and deal relatively briefly with the point you made at the end, and then perhaps speak a little more at length about the very interesting points you were raising earlier. Is it just a happy medium? I think it cannot be. And the example of the image of God shows us that. So the happy medium solution would be, okay, well, then we're half machines and half gods. Keep everybody happy. Well, that doesn't even make sense. Like, what would that be? What the position is showing that the conclusion that we're just machines and the conclusion that we're gods are both dismembered limbs of a harmonious, beautiful whole that have been dressed up as the whole beast, if you like. And in order to make sense of the impulses behind them, you need to look at the integrated whole of the image of God. So it's like Paul again with Greek wisdom. So he's not saying to the Greeks, you're halfway there, just keep going. Their view of what wisdom can be needs utter demolition and reconstruction. But it doesn't need reconstructing as something other than wisdom. It needs reconstructing as true wisdom. And so there's a sense in which that you can't simply meet in the middle, because it's like trying to split the difference between two heresies. What you need to find is the truth from which those heresies originally derived. The other point, really, really interesting point that you make about being both inside and outside. I think there is something unusual about Christianity among world belief systems, including secularism, that predisposes us to this position. And I'm partly getting it from a beautiful book by a theologian called Lamin Sanneh, Senneh, called Translating the Message. And his argument is that from its very inception, Christianity has been fundamentally translatable, in that it has no home culture that is the one true culture in which it can show itself, in contrast to the majority of world belief systems. And he has various arguments to show this, including the fact that the center of world Christianity has just moved around historically in the way that no other religion, including secularism, has. so it's Middle East, and then it's in Europe, and then it's in the United States, and then it's over in Korea, and it's growing in China. And like, where is the center of this thing? And therefore, I think Christianity, particularly and unusually, allows us to be both inside and outside a culture, because it itself has no cultural center of gravity. Any culture that it inhabits, it will transform and challenge. And Sane's argument is that any culture it inhabits, it makes more itself. So he's a Gambian theologian, and he's arguing that when Christianity came to Africa, it didn't make, in its best manifestations, in its purest manifestations, it didn't de-Africanize African people, but it made them, I think his language is more and better Africans, or something like that. Now we can agree or disagree with that particular diagnosis, but I think there's something about the way in which the gospel challenges and fulfills every culture and sits comfortably in none of them, that is particularly helpful in positioning ourselves as Christians both inside and outside. And I think just one final little point on that. The fact that the church is now worldwide, more or less, is incredibly helpful and important for Christians, because it means that we have at our disposal, again, in quite an unusual way, a range of cultural perspectives on the gospel message that allows us to see our own blind spots in ways that would otherwise be very hard to see. If everybody writing on Christianity writing from the same cultural standpoint, it would be very hard to tell what is gospel and what is culture. But the fact that there are, sub-Saharan African theologians, Korean theologians, Indonesian theologians, European theologians, US theologians, all looking at the same scriptures and trying to work them out, enables all of us to make up for each other's blind spots in ways that would otherwise be very hard to do. So we have a great possibility as Christians, given that we belong to a worldwide community, to be both inside and outside in an unusual way, I think.
There's a question here from Tim Johns. Tim, do you want to present this yourself? He's got it on the chat. Okay, I'll read.
Really, no, it's fine, David. Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Sorry, I haven't got a camera, so I'm just on an audio one. Chris, yeah, I'm just interested your use of the prophetic standpoint, and it's something I'm doing some writing on at the moment. That what about the place of unfulfilled prophecy within the Bible, and does unfulfilled prophecy have a place in challenging modern thought? So, for example, the concept that Christ and Paul use about birth pangs, suggesting cycles of angst and pain that will grip the earth as a new birth approaches. Society talks about the perfect storm that we are moving into, political, economic, social, environmental, etc. Does the prophetic angle provide a language using a different narrative and a biblical narrative to explain in an acceptable alternative way what this continuum is that we are seeing in front of us and trying to understand and get to grips with? Probably not very well put, sorry, but that's where my question sits.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Tim. I suspect if you're adding on this, you may know more about this than I do. Let me try and understand the question you're asking. So we're in this perfect storm of sort of tensions and crises in our cultural moment, and your floating the idea that prophecy might be a lens through which to read that. And I'm not quite sure in what way that would work. So how would prophecy make sense of that? Are you able to just say another sentence on that?
Yeah. So you said nearer the beginning, in terms of trying to describe, well, what is the Bible? So the Bible is a living word. The Bible is an active word. The Bible is also offers statements about the state of the world, not only historically, but also going forwards into the future. So the long narrative of the Bible is a narrative of love. It's a narrative which ultimately brings us to a point where the Redeemer, Christ, returns. You've talked about creation, fall, redemption, consummation. So that point of consummation, that point of bringing everything together, is a point, the Christian would say, in time and space. It will happen, just as the birth of Christ happened in time and space. The birth of Christ wasn't seen, it wasn't expected, except by a very small minority. It was rejected. And it's logical to say, well, the same will be true of the second coming of Christ, the return of Christ. That shouldn't be the case, however, because the Bible tells us very clearly there will be signs, there will be indicators to say that this consummation is going to happen at a point in time and in space. And the prophetic articulations in the Old Testament, and indeed within the New, and I guess the book of Revelation comes in as well, give us a lens to say, well, okay, what would those signs look like? And one of them is the sign of birth pangs. Does that, am I making that clear? No. I can see Andrew shaking his head.
I'm not sure whether this will answer your question or not, but let me have a go. It seems that faced with the crises that we most certainly have today, ecological and other, that there are two dominant responses in the culture around us. One of them is really an abject despair. And I think we see a sort of epidemic of hopelessness, perhaps more among younger generations. And it's not just the environment. It's, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but certainly in both Australia and the UK, good luck trying to buy your first house these days. House prices are, and there's a sense in which, well, for young people, well, what is there for me out there? And I think there are statistics to show that people growing up now are the first generation since the Second World War for whom life prospects are almost certainly going to be worse than those of their parents' generation. And that is huge for the way that people see the world. And so there's a great despair out there. And I think another dominant response is a wild-eyed optimism. And in terms of environmental concerns, you see this in what's sometimes called geoconstructivism, the idea that we can sort out all our environmental problems by pumping tons of sulfur into the atmosphere to cool the earth and so forth. We can get ourselves out of this. And I think the way that the Bible meets that situation is that it is both more pessimistic than the pessimist and at the same time more optimistic than the optimist. So in the sense that the Bible says the fundamental issue that we're faced with isn't actually our mismanagement of the environment, for example. That's a symptom of human recalcitrance, what the Bible would call the human heart. And we can't do anything about it. And we can't educate ourselves out of it. We can't finance ourselves out of it. We are sinful in a way that will mean that we do not act in our best interests, and that we will destroy ourselves. And that is very, very bleak. And I think to the extent that we as Christians let that sink in, that, you know, as the little phrase has it, the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. There's a darkness to that, because that's the one thing that we can't solve, because it is us. And so there's a great pessimism there. But there's also an optimism that even outflanks the most wild-eyed eco-optimist, in the sense that the Christian soberly believes in a reality where every tear will be wiped from our eyes, and there will be no more mourning or crying or pain, where the old order of things has passed away. There's a new heavens and a new earth, and every act of injustice that was committed in the dark in the past will be brought out into the open and judged by one who sees perfectly, knows perfectly, and has a perfectly calibrated idea of justice. You know, so that thing that happened in the 18th century that nobody knows about, but that destroyed the life of that one, whatever, girl, that will be dealt with. Justice for the dead. Nobody's claiming that. Like, nobody has an optimistic view of the future that runs to absolute justice for the dead. But the Christian does. Like, when she reads the book of Revelation, that's what she reads. And so the capacity of Christianity to marry a very sober understanding of human potential and capacity, unaided, with an incredibly hopeful view of the future, I think positions us in a way to help and serve a society that has this epidemic of hopelessness at the moment, and gives Christians a message that it brings health and healing, and as well challenge to the hopelessness that's all around us.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Is there a final question that anyone has this evening or this morning?
I have a question about this idea you have, Chris, of I guess you called it the deep critique, and I wonder if you would comment on agape love, because in a sense I see that in the biblical discourse of agape love, that there is a deep level critique of culture, and to use Foucauldian language, that you have a change in the power relations through the inculcation of agape love in the church. So the church then becomes a critique, or I think at its best, is it not true that the church is a critique of culture if it lives up to its its own vision, so to speak? That's my question. Yeah. Do you want to comment on that?
Really fascinating, Gordon. There's a book by a scholar called J. Joyce Schult, S-C-H-U-L-D. I think it's called something like Foucault and Augustine. And the argument is that the work that the idea of power is doing for Foucault is being done by the idea of love in Augustine. So it's this way of being able to range over the whole of society and understand its dynamics, not exhaustively, but for there to be no aspect of society that is untouched by this thing, which is what Foucault thinks of as power. It isn't everything, but it's intermeshed with everything. And so, yes, I think that book is agreeing with the intuition that you just voiced, which is that love is doing something like that for Augustine. And I think the idea that you raise of agapic love in particular as being a critique of perhaps of late modern society is something that I try to do a little bit within the book. So I contrast two forms of desire in the book. And I think, from memory, I call one of them intimacy desire, which is sort of close to agapic love. It's the idea of going deeper and deeper into a relationship with Christ, essentially. That the way in which I love him is by going deep into that relationship. And I contrast that with the sort of desire that pervades modern society, which is a desire that's always flitting from one object to the next. The way that I feed the desire is not by going deeper, it's by getting the next shiny thing. And they're very, very different ideas of desire and love and satisfaction. And I think there might be a critique of society to be sort of framed on those lines. But I fear, just on the last point that you raise, that when we do that with our eyes open, we will find that the church is much more often on the wrong side of the ledger, and part of the culture that needs to be critiqued, rather than some sort of shining city on a hill that's getting everything right and that's setting the pattern for everyone else. I think we are all blind to our blind spots, and church cultures are no exception. And if the Bible is correct, we should expect our churches to be very messy indeed.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I want to end there. But thank you so much, Chris. I just get a sense you've begun a conversation here, because what you've presented us leads to in so many directions to such major questions. I think we're just entering into understanding, if I may use a rather old-fashioned word, the paradigm with which you're speaking. And this really has been wonderfully informative and challenging.